Perfect.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Durso-Finley, and so happy for you to join us tonight. We have a lot of information to cover, so I wanted to get cranking right away. But I wanted to welcome you to Understanding Athletic Recruiting, which is organized by the International College Counselors. And we're going to cover a lot of, like I said, we're going to cover a lot of different ground tonight. And this is part of a presentation that I've done many different times, including a 3-hour version that I do at conferences. So I understand there may be a lot of questions that pop up. We'll try to answer some if we have time at the end of the evening, but you can see my email on the screen, and I'm very, very happy to follow up with questions as they arise, because this is a particularly complicated aspect of college admission in the 21st century. Before I get going, I would love to tell you a little bit about International College Counselors. This is a wonderful group of very experienced folks, educators from all that help students from all over the world. They work with students from all backgrounds and have all kinds of aspirations, working all the way from entering into college for a first year through graduate school and medical school, and can help with school lists, school selection, extracurricular life, thinking about summer activities, application review. It's if you engage with the International College Counselors, you're going to find it an incredibly comprehensive and really supportive environment. And it's since I've joined them, that's one of the things that I found is that it really is a group of informed, intelligent, experienced, and wonderful educators. And I could not recommend more if this is something that you want to, if you want to engage with us going forward beyond just hearing a little bit about athletic recruiting. To give you a little bit of a sense about myself, I worked 10 years in college admission at Brown University, including being their athletic liaison in the admission office. I worked for 20 plus years in college counseling at a very selective and independent boarding school in New Jersey. Was lucky enough to work with some fantastic people to publish a book on athletic recruiting. It has a few different editions, so that's been a great deal of fun for me. But I think in terms of understanding where I'm coming from for this particular presentation, you should know that I played sports in college. I've coached student athletes who've gone on to college. I'm a parent of students who played in college. I was an academic advisor of students when I was a college admission officer, as a college counselor, as an admission officer. Literally have touched every single aspect of a prospective intercollegiate student athlete's life. And that's given me a really overarching and interesting perspective on how to enter into the college admission world when it comes to intercollegiate athletic recruiting, because it can be very opaque, very challenging. And moving back and forth between understanding the rhythms and the explicit processes is something that that I've worked on for a long time, and I love to have these conversations with students and their families as they try to figure this out. All right, so as I said, it's a lot of information that's going to happen in a short period of time. So hold on to your hats, but we're gonna go ahead and dive right in. And as I said, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and if we have time at the end, we'll answer them. If we don't, I will absolutely follow up with you personally to try to get those questions answered. All righty? All right. So we're going to start off with how you enter into this process. All right. So a student says or thinks to themselves, "I would like to play sports in college." As a counselor, one of the things that we always do is come right back and say, well, what do you mean by this? Right? Because so many high school student athletes just see it as a part of their day. Right? So they're not necessarily thinking about the ramifications of what they do if they enter into the college athletics world. So when I work with a prospective student athlete, I always push it right back on them and say, when you say you want to play sports in college, what do you mean? And that question engenders a whole other set of questions. And so when you enter into the athletic recruiting process, there's an awful lot of self-reflection that goes in to figure out what's the best way to have a fantastic experience. Most students, when they say, "Oh, I want to understand athletic recruiting," want to know, NCAA eligibility rules or the sliding scale or things that are necessary to know, but they aren't critical to a good student athlete's experience. So that's where I start. So again, that question creates more questions. When you say, I want to play sports in college, are you just thinking, I only want to play at the highest level? I want to play D1, and that's it. right? Or if you just want to find any college to play your sport, and those are the students that are the easiest to work with. They, if you just grew up playing soccer and you want to keep playing soccer and get a good education, you could do it. There's no question about it. If you want to try to receive scholarship aid, that gets a little bit more complicated. We can talk about those complications. Or I work with a lot of students who just want to improve their college options. They've got a good academic record and they're strong athletes, and they want to say, hey, if I put these two things together, I might be able to gain access at an institution that one on its own might not allow me. So, more questions, more questions. So let's get to the Division I piece, right? So if the prospective student athletes who are on this Zoom webinar, said, "Yo, I want to be Division I," there are still more questions to be asked, right? Right. So when you say Division I, are you thinking highly selective only? I work with a lot of students who say, I want to play at Stanford, I want to play at Duke, I want to play at Vanderbilt, I want to play at Georgetown. I don't necessarily want to play at the University of Utah. Okay, well, that's Division I. Right? And that's a choice that you may have to make depending on the feedback that you get from coaches. Do you need to be actively recruited and have a guaranteed spot on the team? Are you willing to work for that spot? Right? Are you willing to, kind of walk on? Are you willing to risk being cut in order to have that Division I spot? And a lot of that depends on the sport and the level. We need to think about what your thresholds are for entering into a Division I program. Right? So that's something to just sort of keep in mind when you're thinking, yeah, it's D1 only. And it's a very interesting kind of geographic and academic difference that, if we're in, Texas or Arizona, or oftentimes in Florida and Georgia, it's Division I only, right? They don't necessarily think about D2 or D3 when you can have an incredible academic and athletic experience at those places. So, and sort of leads into the next piece of this notion of, do you just want to find a place to play your sport? Right? Are you open to different divisions? Are you open to, I don't work with a ton of kids who go to the NAIA, but it's an incredible organization that stretches from British Columbia to South Florida. And students who want to participate in their sport can find a fantastic experience. Are you open to different kinds of colleges? When you talk about regional preferences, selectivity preferences, I often say, well, do you want your parents to see you play? Right. So are you willing to travel to have that athletic opportunity? Or do you need to be in a place where your parents are going to be able to jump in the car most of the time and see you participate? So you just have to think about things like geography and opportunity to play, size, division. That's part of the internal questioning and calculus that you have to go through before we even get to the process of working with coaches. If you're somebody who's looking into to receive scholarship aid, for example, this is one of the reasons why I started doing the programs along these lines, is because we were so tired of student athletes getting these emails and letters saying, here's how you win a scholarship. Realistically, only between, depending on whose numbers you use, only between 1% and 2% of all student athletes across the entire NCAA receive scholarship aid to participate. All right, so it's possible, and with some of the new changes out there, with the name, image, and likeness, and the new lawsuit that came down, people are going to be thinking that they're going to be seeing all these zeros out there, when in fact it really is only going to affect a very small number of student athletes who participate. So are you willing to think about Division II? Because there's an awful lot of scholarship aid that exists there. Are you willing to walk on to a place at first to get your scholarship later on? You can do it, but it's a tremendous amount of work. So it's a conversation to have with me, or somebody, your ICC counselor, or with your counselor back home, about what your priority is, right? And so again, as I mentioned when we first started getting rolling, if you are looking to improve your college options, right? I have these two skills, athletic and academic, and I know one on its own is not going to necessarily give me the opportunity that I want. Do I want to pursue that, right? Now, again, more questions, right? If you're the sixth person, on a 5-person D1 list, are you willing to drop to Division III or play at a high-level club team in your intercollegiate experience? Right? Are you willing to totally let go? right? Do you have a very restricted list of potential colleges? I work with students all the time, who will say, yeah, I want to play soccer at Santa Clara. I want to play soccer at Gonzaga. I want to play soccer at Portland, but I'm not going to go play at Claremont McKenna. It's like, okay, like you get to make that choice, right? Depending on the feedback that you get from your coaches. But it's something you have to think about as you enter into the recruiting stream. Where does your threshold lie for the things that you want to get out of the process? And again, I work with a good number of Division III kids. In fact, I work with kids all the way from the ones that are signing NLIs and national letters of intent, excuse me for the jargon, receiving scholarships to students who are just walking on Division III schools, the entire range. But some of them will say, no, I only want to be in the Northeast, or I only want to stay in Virginia, or I want to stay 150 miles from home. That's great. You are figuring out what you want out of your intercollegiate athletic experience. But it sort of lends into a point that I'm gonna hit in just a second. Now, again, I mentioned that when we start having conversations about understanding athletic recruiting, that students often very, very quickly move to, well, how do I do it? What are the requirements? All right. And working with the NCAA clearinghouse, with Clearinghouse, what's now called the Eligibility Center, is very, very straightforward. They're going to give you a sliding scale, and for all the complaints that people have about the NCAA, the literature that they have actually on the website is fantastic. You can understand exactly the contact periods. You can understand exactly the sliding scale, what makes you eligible within Division I, Division II, and Division III. All right, so this Venn diagram here shows you how much space there is where if your academic standing meets the NCAA requirements in the sliding scale, and you have official offer of support from a coach, and this is at really NCAA, so Division I and Division II, that hoop you're trying to jump through is actually quite broad. And that's especially true at schools that nowadays don't have standardized testing requirements. It's very, very easy to qualify. All right. Now, as you start to, I mentioned so many things about distance from home, selectivity, financial aid, and then the other influences are like things like squad size, right? So if you're sitting there, as part of this webinar thinking, okay, I want to go to a highly selective Division I, Northeast or Mid-Atlantic. I want to play lacrosse at Duke or Georgetown, or I want to play football, things like that. Especially if there's a low number sport, right? And you're adding all of these pieces. Right? I want to play, we use lacrosse because that's an easy one. I want to play lacrosse at the University of Pennsylvania. Okay. You are essentially putting all of these Venn diagrams together and trying to hit that little tiny diamond in the center. So again, think about the range between Division I scholarship, recruited, guaranteed spot at one end of the continuum, and I just want to find a place to play my sport and get a great education on the other end of the continuum. Right? Those are the things that sort of just put in your mind as you start to consider that kind of aspect. Okay, so this leads to some maxims that I always talk about with my prospective student athletes, which is just off that last Venn diagram. The more restrictions you place on your goals, the harder they are to achieve. I want to play soccer somewhere. I want to get a Division I scholarship at a highly selected school. Okay, that's the continuum. The other thing that I think students don't necessarily realize as they move into this is that their goals will need to be constantly reevaluated. Your transcript's going to be evaluated. Your tape and your performance is going to be evaluated. You will have coaches that will say, oh my gosh, you can totally play for me. And coaches that will say, you cannot play for me. And you have to handle that, right? Or admission officers that will say, we can't support this transcript. Or that they will say, we can totally support this transcript. Let us know if this is something that you want. But one of the things that I always say with my prospective student athletes is that there are lots of aspects about this that are outside your control and aspects that are within your control, but the responsibility for controlling that part of it is the student athletes. It's not the parents, not the club coach, it's not the high school coach, it's not the college counselor. They all have different roles, but communication, responsibility, question asking, understanding the process, that falls within the prospective student athlete's realm, right? So if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, Coaches are going to work with you to maximize your abilities to be recruited from an athletic perspective. What are the skills, dispositions, and talents that you need in order to be successful in this particular sport? That's their goal, right? An ICC counselor, the way I try to describe it to my student athletes is to say, right, what I can do is help you be find the right fit and be the most recruitable student athlete you can possibly be, whether it's by fit, whether it's by program, whether it's by admission practice. And that's the role that a counselor can add to it, to help you ask good questions and figure out your way through the process, so long as you're willing to take on that responsibility to ask those questions. Okay. So this leads into what I was just saying in terms of, sort of the roles and responsibilities of a prospective student athlete. So from the very first contact, from the very first time you talk to a coach, the very first time you fill out a recruiting questionnaire, all the way from you walk across the stage, right? There's individual responsible action that has to come from that student athlete, right? And it's important to know, because as I mentioned when we just got going, when you're in high school, it's just what you do from 3:15 to 5:30 in the afternoons, right? It's how you organize your summers. When you're in college, it's a very, very different experience. And that's not to dissuade anybody from entering into it. It's just, you need that foreknowledge, okay? Some of it is your academic preparation. Some of it is the goal setting, as I was just describing. Right? Some of it is that student-driven action. Right? Some of it is the question asking about programs and levels and expectations, right? And again, most of the student athletes who are here were probably like the alphas on their team. They've never had to fight for playing time, right? They've never had to worry about people thinking that they're the best kids on the field or on the court, right? But that being able to handle a little bit of uncertainty and adversity for many student athletes as they move on to the process, right? It's new to them. Okay. And then I would further add, and this gets amplified sort of in the post-COVID world, right? That that the communication, from prospective student athletes and from high schoolers has been challenging, right? Because everybody got separated, right? But coaches demand really good communication. Okay, so these are some of the roles and responsibilities I think of a prospective student athlete that you need to incorporate. Right. So I'm going to sort of before I get into the practical aspects of how to do this, I'm going to divert a little bit into helping you to sort of understand some of the big picture concepts of what's the academic impact on your experience if you're an intercollegiate student athlete, what's the personal, a little bit about the distinctions between leagues, but not a ton. But do talk a little bit about successful habits and behaviors, because as I mentioned, that's very different in a secondary school versus intercollegiate school. All right. So what does it mean to be an intercollegiate student athlete? Right. Academically, there's a tremendous amount of upsides, right? Because you have a very disciplined life. Everybody else who's not playing a sport, right, is going bonkers, because they went from having being at school from 8 until 3:15 or whatever their academic schedule was, to having 11 hours of class a week. Right, you have a much more disciplined life because you have to take care of your classes. You have to get treatment. You have to be on the field at a certain time. You get far better advising than most students. Academic advising in college is terrible. I will throw that out there. Right, you may have study halls. You may have tutors that go on the bus with you. It's very structured. They want you to succeed. The academic progress rate is a real thing, right? Whereas, generally you're kind of left on your own if you don't have something to ground you, right? Potential downsides in terms of your academic life, in terms of a little bit of time. I mean, you may be on a bus and you may be gone for 72 hours. There may be coaches that say, oh, you want to do pre-med? No. If you're going to do pre-med, you have to take all your lab classes in the summer, because we can't have you in a lab that runs from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock. And these are things you have to find out when you're assessing a team and assessing a program. I've worked with a lot of students that would say, yeah, you can do, the coach said, you can do a study abroad program, but it has to happen in our off season. You can't do it in the fall when we're in season. And we would prefer that you do it in the summer. Okay. And probably the one that's the most frustrating and it's the most nuanced and difficult is this notion of sort of professors and peers who devalue your intellect. And that's incredibly frustrating, right? And no matter where you go, if you go to, I've sent kids to Harvard and Princeton as athletes. I've sent kids to, as I mentioned, University of Utah and University of Tennessee, Chattanooga as athletes, and they all say the same thing: is that when they put on their sweater, or they put on their jacket, they have friends in the dorm who instantly assume that they're only there to play their sport, and they're not smart, and they don't care about their academics. And that's something that you have to take on if you're going to enter into the intercollegiate athletic stream. It's just part of what you need to do. So just again, it's not a reason. It's not something that should dissuade you. It's something you need to know that you're going to have to move forward, right? From the personal extracurricular side, right, the upsides of being part of a team are fantastic, right? You have an established peer group, especially if it's a fall sport. You feel immense pride representing your school. You've got more structure. You learn leadership. You've got challenges, right? You have connections to alumni, right, and professional opportunities beyond. It's an amazing, amazing opportunity, right, to be part of that. And so I often encourage students who don't end up being recruited, but who are at high participation sports, things like football, crew, track and field, wrestling, where they don't have squad size limits, or squad size limits are so high that they don't necessarily have to worry about it, to be part of that experience. Because it gives you that upside, right, of that extracurricular life. Obviously the downsides are that limitations on time, a little bit of freedom. I've worked with coaches who played, and with students who played football, and part of what their experience was is that at 10 o'clock on a Friday night on a game weekend, their position coach would call them at 10 o'clock and make sure that they were in bed, and they'd ask them some questions about the game plan, to make sure they weren't out on the town, right? You need to be in bed. You need to get your sleep, right? If you play a winter sport, for example, right, you don't necessarily assume you're going to go home for vacations. I had a son who wrestled, and where he wrestled in college, and where he wrestled, the school ended on December 10th, and for the fall term, and they returned on January 19th. And he returned to school he was in school until December 23rd, and came back on December 27th. And they all lived in the same dorm, and they got meal cards for Subway, and wrestled twice a day, right? And that's just the way it was. If you do a winter sport like swimming or squash or those kinds of things, basketball, again, not a reason not to do it, because it was incredible. It was an incredible bonding experience. But you just got to know when you go in that could be part of it, and that even kind of filters down to the Division III level, even though it's not quite as restrictive. Okay. Now, if we're talking about divisional differences, and again, it depends on where you're being evaluated by coaches, and although from that perspective, if you end up in a Division I world, and even there's some gradations with the Division I world, certainly, if you're at FBS versus the football championship subdivision and the old 1AA environment, it's a little bit different, but you should expect a year-round commitment. I played in the old 1AA, and they were coaches that would look at you funny, and they would say, "So you're not staying on campus in the summer and working out?" I'm like, "No, I got to go home. I have to work, and with my family responsibilities." And you could just see them kind of shake their head, because there's some heavy control about it being a full-time job. You're going to travel more, and that's especially true as things have changed with the conferences. Obviously there's some differences in whether it's scholarship or non-scholarship. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got a Division III environment, right, where there's a much more balanced affirmation. The requirements are much more season specific. And there's a little bit less reach, and so you might be able to do more extracurricular clubs and things like that. You have a few more opportunities to do two sports if you're a multi-sport athlete, but even that's starting to really disappear. But it's just something when you start to think about what you want your intercollegiate athletic experience to be like, and what you want your overall collegiate experience to be like, this is where you have to start to think about what you want your day-to-day life, experience, how it's going to evolve, how it's going to move from day to day, what are the things that you want to do, to get to have the best experience that you can, as you move through college. So you go back to those original questions and add this kind of to the mix of the things that you might want to consider when you're starting to think about which coaches you're going to reach out to. Okay. So if there's a slide in this deck that's the most important from my perspective, this is the one. Okay. So these are the successful habits and behaviors of intercollegiate scholar athletes, right? And these are the things that you need to be able to do to be successful in college, right? And it's about self-regulation, right? Your study habits, your eating habits. You're going to have a big, long list of team rules that you have to adhere to. You need to be self-advocate with your professors. So if you're going away for 72 hours on the bus and you have a team and you have a group project, you need to be the person who reaches out to that group and says, hey, I'm going to be away. I want to meet on Wednesday to make sure I'm getting my part of the responsibility done, not I'm going to be away, I can't do it. Okay. And then the two other things, that I would throw out there is this notion of, like, if you want to be a college athlete, you better love to work out. Like, love it, love it, love it, love it. Right? Because your summer expectations are going to be logged and followed. And even in season, you may, depending on your sport, you may have 6 a.m., 7 a.m. lifts when you're in season. So just know that that's going to be part of it. And the second piece is this humility in the face of setbacks. As I mentioned, most of the prospective student athletes on this webinar, I would assume, are students who, are the real impact players on their team, right? So what happens when you get there and you're fourth on the depth chart? What happens if you get hurt, right? How are you going to handle that, right? And some students handle it really, really well. For some students, it's incredibly frustrating because they didn't think that was going to be part of their experience. They were used to just being the alphas, okay? And so when I often give this presentation to a group of students in a school, I'll get somebody who raises their hand and says, okay, this is great, but honestly, what's the most important thing about being recruited? Is it your 40 time? Is it your bench press? And I'll say, absolutely not. The biggest indicators of being successful as a college athlete are nutrition and sleep. Those are the things that are going to make a difference into your ability to be successful. Okay. Now, that's the philosophy that's sort of floating out there. Now we're going to move on to a little bit more of the practicality. All right. This is oftentimes when I do this presentation in person, when a student or a parent would kind of lean forward with their pad. All right. So these are the previous stages of athletic recruiting. This was before things kind of exploded. But I like to leave this here because everybody's heard about the students who committed in 9th grade, and the quarterback at LSU who committed in 8th grade and all those sorts of things. And things have waxed and waned in terms of that, in terms of those rhythms. But I leave this here because it's really helpful for students and parents to understand this is the process that it goes through. You're identified, you're evaluated, you're recruited, and then you go through the commitment stage. And for the highest level, that could happen early and it could happen fast. For the students who are just trying to find a place to play, this may start in the junior spring and go through the summer and senior fall and make commitment, and that happens then. Right? But whether it happens like super, super quick, or whether it's something that goes through over a period of time, this is the process that students go through. So this is how I keep the framework to help people understand where they're coming from. Okay. Identification. So the identification stream is very easy to get involved in. And I can help you draft your athletic resume, your letter of introduction, things that you want to put on the online web-based questionnaires. Anybody who's on this webinar who is a student, I invite you to find 8 schools that you're interested in potentially to participate. Webinar closes down, get on your laptop, go fill out the recruiting questionnaire that's going to exist at every single athletic department website. Okay. And I bet you're going to get 3 or 4 emails within the next 24 hours that says, thank you so much for reaching out. We're so excited to hear about your interest in our program. And most often, they're going to invite you to take part in one of their summer camps, because that's a great way for identification for them. But you're not being recruited at that stage, but you have been identified. You're in the database. Every single program, whether it's Division III or Division I, has a graduate student, an assistant coach, a recruiting coordinator, somebody who maintains the database. And you want to get in that database. One of the biggest mistakes that student athletes that I've worked with have made, and I said, well, what happened? Like, what? And I said, well, I just assumed that I get contacted by coaches. Like, no. You can contact coaches and recruiting coordinators directly, and it's part of the process. Okay. And there's other parts to this in terms of the identification, the camps, but you need to get into the identification stage. And the easiest thing to do, right, as I said, is to use those online questionnaires. But you need to think about what's relevant to your sport. Are you in a time sport? Are you in a distance sport? In terms of track and field, are you? Those are the easiest ones. Are you in a ranked sport? Are you in golf and squash and tennis, or fencing? And you need to adhere to those statistical comparisons. The subjective sports are a little bit harder, but you want to be identified and placed within the context of that particular program. And it's really straightforward if you take the time to get that information out in people's hands. Okay. And then, just know as you move out of the identification stage, you are going to start to be evaluated based on your communication. You're going to be based on the those summer camps, as I mentioned, the tapes. I know I'm old, I say tapes, but the video that you submit, right? The conversations that you have with coaches, right? You're always being evaluated. All right. And so what'll happen is that if you're identified and evaluated and the coach thinks you can play for them and they've seen your transcript, right? Then they start moving into the recruitment stage, right? And it used to be very straightforward back in the old days where you would be written contact, email contact, text contact, and then starting on July 1, they could have phone contact weekly, and then it opened up after that. They would do school visits, right? But one of the things that's really complicated and interesting about the recruitment stage is that you have to have some of that be vetted or translated by a counselor, and I can do that. Because you have to analyze the frequency, style, and direction of that contact. I've definitely worked with students, who have said, have come in to talk to me in the fall. They say, "Oh, I'm being recruited by X school." I said, "That's awesome, right? When was the last time you talked to the coach?" They're like, "Oh, March." Like, okay, I hate to tell you, son, but if you haven't talked to the coach since March and it's now October, like you're not being recruited, no matter what happened on those initial contacts. So I help student athletes understand the frequency and the style of the direction of what's happening from the recruitment. Look at the emails, find out about the phone calls, talk about the invitations to visit campus to help students understand where they are. Okay. But again, it's identification, it's recruitment, evaluation, and then recruitment. And then they move on to the commitment stage, which is again, for some students it happens very, very quickly. For others, it's a little bit more nuanced, right? But it could be you're signing a national letter of intent. If you're applying to Ivy League schools, they may give you a likely letter. If you're applying to Division III schools or even some Division I schools, they're going to turn around and say, okay, if I'm going to support you, you have to apply early decision, right? And this is again, the mutual commitment exchange for support. This is a great time to bring me or to bring your college counselor at your school or even your coach into the conversation to make sure that what's being said, what's being heard, and what's being understood are all the same things. And I'm sure that absolutely everybody on this call, right, or on this webinar has a friend who has a story about somebody that they know who they were sure they were going to be admitted to a particular school for a particular sport, and it didn't work out. And I can say with great confidence that 95% of those circumstances were because of miscommunication and misunderstanding. All right. And so when you get to the commitment stage, it's time to sort of marshal the forces and make sure that everybody is on the same page and understands that where they're going. Okay. Um, so I think, we talked a lot about, the sort of like, how do you get to this stage, right? Obviously, you have to optimize your academic and athletic foundations, play at the highest levels within your sport, follow the step-by-step athletic recruiting process that we're describing, understanding those skills and dispositions and know you fit within the larger models, right? Coach speak is very, very elusive, which is why you need some filters and some translators, and have some some intent to apply thoughtfully to find good academic fits. If you're working with your academic credentials, obviously you have to choose courses very carefully, balance your NCAA eligibility, which you can do within the information that's available at the school. You find your faculty mentors, develop a testing plan where you are. I'm not a big proponent of SATs, but if you're a student athlete, you absolutely have to push that hard, because the goal is to arrive at the admission office, right, with everything in check. Eligibility, done. Strong academic record, done. Support from the coach, done. That admission officer looks at that and goes, flip, 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 good. Off we go, right? Not anything that they have to worry about. That's your goal, okay? So if you're, if you want to be successful in this process, right, these are the steps, right? You have to understand the recruiting process, and I know this is a speed version in 45 minutes, so we're getting started, and you deserve great props for being here, right? Because this will help you get your kind of mind going as to where you might want to enter into this process, and we can help you get over the finish line. There's no question about it, right? But like your thoughtful research into programs, into colleges, like your self-advocacy with coaches and with the professors and with your peer group, developing really good communication and listening skills, figuring out where you fit within a conference or a division or a school and your sport. These are all things that are incredibly important to navigate the athletic recruiting process really, really well. And those are some of the things that I think you need to kind of file away as you enter into it, versus these very specific, who do I talk to, or how do I do this, or how do I get recruited? This is how you have an incredibly successful intercollegiate athletic recruiting experience, is if you sort of take these topics in and move through them in all of their depth. Okay, so at athletic credentials, obviously you're seeking the highest levels of competition. You're attending to your rankings, as I mentioned earlier. One of the best things you can figure out is, what is the timeline for my sport at my level, and to be able to ask questions of coaches, to be able to say, what does it take to become a recruitable athlete for you? Right. I actually was working with a student, earlier today, and said, okay, when we get to this stage at the end of your summer season, you are going to start to reach out to coaches and say, what is the threshold for their particular sport at which I start to become interesting for you? Right? And knowing what that threshold is will enable them to have a better recruiting experience, because they're not, sending out, applications at places where they're not going to be supported. And one of the stories that I sometimes tell is that when I was in high school, I got a letter from Boston College to play football, and I went nuts, like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And then like the next day I woke up and thought to myself, there is no way I can play at Boston College. Like, just knowing my own athletic ability and where I fit within their program. And that really helped me to reorient how I was going to apply, who I was going to approach. But that, in terms of like all of the stuff that they sent out, I didn't bite, right? Because I knew I didn't fit within that program. And that's part of the sort of more sophisticated understanding of what it takes to be successful at where you want to play. Okay. So we're coming right to the very end here. All right. So we can be, coach speak is elusive, as I said. We can be a translator. We can help you understand those emails and those communications and what they say in those phone calls and the coded language that they use. I will say that these communication basics are incredibly important. Like, you have to be organized, respond to and keep track of all those emails. Don't think you can remember them, because you can't. They're all going to roll into one, right? You have to ask awesome questions, right? Listen carefully to what's being said by the coaches, right? Save all those emails, right? Because that communication and listening aspect of stuff, as you go through, especially the evaluation and the recruiting stage, right, is really imperative. Okay, because as coaches go through that process before they get to the commitment stage, what are the phrases that I often use is they have one foot on the grass and one foot on the brake simultaneously, right? So they don't want to lose you, even though they might not recruit you. So you have to figure out where you fit within their paradigm. And you can ask those questions. You can say, Coach, how many goalies do you have on your recruiting list who are ahead of me? And when do you think you're going to know? Right? They don't mind those questions, but you have to be able to ask those questions. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up here. Just to, again, we're a lot of philosophy, some practicality, right? The most important thing, as I mentioned, is that if you're sitting there and you're thinking, I just want to play, I haven't played field hockey, I haven't played volleyball, and I want to have a great college experience and a great academic experience, there is absolutely no question you can do it. No question in my mind. Okay. But you as the students need to drive the process, ask the good questions, communicate with the coaches. Like your responsibility, only begins when you get accepted at a particular college. As you've heard me say multiple times, you need to ask good questions, seek good answers, listen to what you hear, right? Accepting honest feedback and perhaps having to reorient is incredibly important. And you have to seek out good resources, right? Good resources are, again, peers that have gone through the process who are on your club team ahead of you. You can talk to your club coach and just hear a little bit about the feedback of where you might be able to play. You can talk to, again, depending on your high school and the depth of experience with the counseling staff. You can work with us because I work with literally hundreds of student athletes to be able to move through that process. But that's really where I think part of the goal of this program is to sort of is again, not necessarily to seed the field with answers, but to give you the information of what questions, right? And I think that most students and educators and parents know, right? Knowing what questions to ask is oftentimes more important than knowing the answers, right? Because the questions to ask are going to give you more nuanced answers. So if you have follow-up questions, you're completely welcome to reach out to me. If you just to send me a direct email. I saw a couple questions came in really quickly early on. It's probably we're right at 7:44, and I promised I would close off at 7:45. So as a good student, as former student athlete, I've hit my mark. But you can use the QR code that's on there to connect with us. There's my email. You can reach out directly to me. If there are other aspects of the process, ICC has a really broad range of products and experiences for students. If you're from Florida, do you want to stay in Florida and you want to see how that works out? We can do that. There's essay work. There's packages for senior onlys if that's where you are in your experience. There's a lot of breadth. And if you reach out to me, I will put you in touch with the right people, answer your questions, and I'm happy to go from there. So it looks like my clock just turned over to 7:45. So the questions that came in, I will go ahead and respond to personally, but I really appreciate your attention tonight. And as I said, please feel free to reach out to me, and just know that, the students that are on the webinar tonight, you can do this. You absolutely 100% can do it. And if you need some help, let me know. All right. Thanks. Have a great night.